once upon a time, caught up in hearing so much rubble and observing so much going on, was still looking for a particular voice in all that he saw and in all that he heard, and he never once got that impression that he was looking for. Until we are told that that voice was found, not in all of that commotion, not in all of that scenery, but in a still, small voice. Now this can be and should be interpreted for us, because our faith knows only commotion, our faith knows only noise, our faith knows only so much rubbish. Our faith knows so much, but it doesn't know what still voice to look out for. Now that still voice, that quiet voice, that voice found in quietness, this is that voice of the living God's new covenant promise. And there are different and random understandings of what this new covenant promise is, when it is located, where, but we're just going to stick to Bible. Because despite what theories exist, Bible triumphs theories. The only narrative that matters, the only paradigm that matters, the only perspective that matters is what we can articulate from piecing the things in the Bible together. That should make sense. But for the majority, it does not. For us, in our dialogue and in our communion together, we understand that this makes sense. And so making that sense, we have to make sense of that voice, because our faith is to rely on a voice. That voice is a particular commandment, So look in the book of 2 John 1 and verse 4. 2 John chapter 1 and verse 4. 2 John chapter 1 and verse 4. 2 John chapter 1 and verse 4 reads, I rejoiced greatly that I found of thy children walking in truth, as we have received a commandment from the Father. And this is really what I wanted to point out in this one verse. Although there's other verses connected to this that will shed greater light on this one verse, but the key point here is that we have received a commandment from the living Father. We have received a commandment, and this commandment is connected to that same living Father's truth. Going into the book of Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 and 2. Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 and 2. This commandment is a truth, and this truth that is a commandment is connected to something very specific. Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 and 2 reads, God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. And so this commandment that is truth, it is a speaking to us by that Son. Now we have to ask, what is that voice again? What is that voice? What is that speech? How is it that this Son is speaking to us? Is there a literal individual speaking to us today that we can go to and say, hey, this is that Son? Or are we looking at the bodily operation of priests and pastors and going, this is that Son speaking? Or are we reading their theories and listening to their conjectures and going, this is that Son speaking to us? What is this Son? Because this is very specific. This is an isolated phrase. What is this Son that right now is speaking to us? So the author of the book of Hebrews is very specific, and they've isolated this point. They've isolated this point to where we are supposed to look at this as how we would look at it, or as what it is. Now we may read this and go, whatever we think we believe this Son to be, that is what is spoken to us, and we have different interpretations for that. That's all well, so be it. Or we can look at this the way that the Bible would have us. This is a phrase, has spoken unto us in these last days by his Son. This is a phrase of speech, and a phrase of acknowledging a thing, or a particular figure, or a particular context. Entering into the book of Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4, 11 to 13. Ephesians chapter 4, 11 to 13. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 to 13. And he gave some apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come into the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. So when we're hearing this phrase, has spoken unto us in these last days by his Son, we have to add on to that, because this makes no sense if we're going to just keep it at that. We will have to make sense of that if we just keep it at that, and who knows where we will take that. But linking what is in Hebrews to what is in Ephesians, we get a better understanding of what of this Son is spoken to us. And so what of this Son is spoken to us is actually a knowledge of the Son of God is what is being communicated to us at this point in time. And this knowledge, jumping back, is a faith. I'll read it again. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 13, till we all come into the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. So this and is linking these two things together. This and is making the knowledge of and the faith of synonymous. So we have received a commandment from the living Father. This commandment is a truth. This truth is a speech from his Son. This Son is a knowledge. This knowledge is a faith. So in essence, the voice that our faith is supposed to communicate with is a faith of knowledge, given by the living God as a commandment for us to do. And this commandment is the living God's truth. Context again, because when it comes to this phrase, is the living God's truth, that's not the same thing as saying the sky is blue. That's the truth. The context changes. The living God's truth is an act. The book of Philippians 3, and we will see this. Philippians 3, verse 8 and 9. Philippians 3, verses 8 and 9. Philippians 3, verses 8 and 9. Yea, doubtless, I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ, and be found in him, this is the key, not having mine own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith. And so what we're seeing here is that this voice is connected to a creation encouraging loss, and that loss being connected to what is religious law. So losing, because the things that Paul here is talking about, they're not secular things, they're not natural things in its primary context. The context here is religious and spiritual, philosophical. Paul is suffering the loss of philosophical, doctrinal, theological things. We know this because he is saying that his righteousness is gained from them, in the law of them. Cutting himself off from this religious law, and these religious laws opens him up to a righteousness, a new righteousness by faith. And so we're placed in a bit of a funky situation here because traditionally we believe righteousness to be what? Goodness, piety, piousness, if that's even a word, piousness, piety, demeanor, holier than thou, righteous by whatever we want to connect that to. But in the Bible, I believe we have reviewed this before in episodes prior, but in the Bible, righteousness does not mean what we would believe righteousness is. In the Bible, righteousness is an act. Righteousness is an act. The righteousness of God is an act of kindness. This act of kindness is to be received by faith and not via religious laws, theories, commandments, baptisms, rites, policies, principles, so on and so forth that are handwritten and passed down. So when we're hearing this righteousness, the righteousness of God by faith, rightly translating it, it is the kindness of the living God by faith. And this is what the book of Titus tells us in chapter 3. It is the kindness of the living God. Let's look at this. Psalms. The book of Psalms. The Psalms 85. Psalm 85. Psalm 85, 12 and 13. Psalm 85, 12 and 13. Psalm 85, 12 and 13. Yea, the Lord shall give that which is good, and our land shall yield her increase. Righteousness shall go before him, and shall set us in the way of his steps. Now, if we're paying attention to this, whatever righteousness is, it is supposed to lead our feet. Not literal, primarily, or firstly, but the feet of our heart and mind. Our feet are two. We have two within us that are supposed to guide our natural feet. Our feet are our heart and mind. Whatever the righteousness of God is, it is to direct our steps. It is to direct our steps, whatever this righteousness is. So this righteousness is for direction. It is not for esteem. It is not for ego, as we would think. This righteousness in the Bible's context is for direction. Whatever this righteousness is, it is a balm. It is a balm of direction. Psalm 35, 28. Psalm 35, 28. Psalm 35, 28. Psalm 35, 28 reads, And my tongue shall speak of thy righteousness and of thy praise all the day long. Again, that and there's connecting these two terms as meaning one. Righteousness means praise. Righteousness means praise. The righteousness of God is the praise of God. So when we think about praise, when we're praising someone, we're praising them for something. Righteousness is an act of praising or of being praised for something. Psalm 40 verse 10. Psalm 40 verse 10. The book of Psalms, still in Psalm 40 verse 10. I have not hid thy righteousness within my heart. I have declared thy faithfulness and thy salvation. I have not concealed thy loving kindness. And again, we return to this. I have not concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation. So here we have a slew of terms better translating this word righteousness for us. When we hear righteousness, we ought to hear truth. We ought to hear loving kindness. We ought to hear salvation. And I would say more clearly, we ought to think of faithfulness. So when we hear Paul saying, I have suffered all things for loss for the righteousness of God by faith, he's actually saying, I have suffered all things for the faithfulness of God by faith, for the faithfulness of God by faith. Righteousness equals faithfulness. Whatever the righteousness of God is, it is an act of the living God's faithfulness towards us. It is an act of the living God's praise. It is an act of the living God's loving kindness. Psalm 111. Psalm 111, verse 2 and 3. Psalm 111, verse 2 and 3. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. His work is honorable and glorious, and his righteousness endureth forever. Righteousness, the righteousness of the living God, is his honor. It is his glory. It is his faithfulness. And hopefully this will change things on how you actually perceive this term righteousness, because we have an idea and a misunderstood idea of what this term righteousness is due to traditional or denominational patterns of thought and habits of mind, and also due to our own internal decision on what this term is. But when we're looking in the Bible, we're looking at what the righteousness of God is. And according to the Bible, this term righteousness is an act. It is an act of faithfulness. It is an act of loving kindness. It is the truth of the living God. It is the glory of the living God. It is the praise. It is the honor. So when we're thinking of this term righteousness, we're not, we ought not to think about it as relating to the individual as something that can be seen or as something that can be displayed. Righteousness is not something that is to be displayed or something, it's to the Bible, righteousness is an act. So when we're hearing about this voice that our faith needs to rely on, and that this voice that our faith needs to rely on, this voice is the living God's righteousness. What we're really being told by the Bible is that our faith needs to rely on what the faithfulness of the living God is, what the praise of the living God is. What is the living God to be praised for? Do we even know this? Do we know what the living God is supposed to be praised for? The living God is a creator. Creation has the living God's name on it. Now, we cannot simply just be like, creation is beautiful and so is God. Yeah. We have to look beyond that, because each and every single one of us is a creation. We look like what is out there. We look done. But what separates us from what is out there is that what is out there obeys the commandment day in, day out, season in, season out, without question, without doubt. It obeys the commandment that it has received. We, on the other hand, have no idea what the living God's commandment is. And we are assuming to believe it through ritual, through tradition, through theory, and it is completely wrong. When we can get to the level of what nature is, we too will be one with our Creator. But in order to do that, we have to know what the commandment is, as it says, as John told us, that we have received a commandment from the Father. We need to know this commandment. This commandment is not found, as we've seen previously in our times together, this commandment is not found in the religious world. You will not find this commandment in the religious world. This commandment can come only as you take time observing the words. Observing meaning mentally, and then putting them into action that are within the Bible. And truth be told, from our first meeting up until now, we have been discussing what this commandment is. In terms, this commandment is justification. This commandment is the righteousness of God, or the faithfulness of God. So then the question is, what is the faithfulness of God? What is God to be faithful to us for? What are we to praise the living God for is what I'm trying to get at. What are we to praise? Why is the living God worth your time? Is it because of a fable? Is it because of a belief that you have or that is popular? Or is it something that is supposed to be more intimate? Is it a promise? We keep returning to Abraham's philosophy, how this individual moved by faith on a promise and was accounted righteous for it. And so if we're going to believe that Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, Galatians 3, and has done this for the purpose that the blessing of Abraham may be shared with us, and not the blessing of Moses, we need to really take into account and into consideration that Abraham's manner of moving in his belief is what we are to now adopt, if liberated from, as Paul says, not by my own righteousness, which is of the law, but through the righteousness of God, which is by faith. This liberation needs to be ours to claim. Psalm 111 verses 2 and 3 lets us know. It lets us know that the righteousness of God is a work. The righteousness of God is a work. The righteousness of God is his faithfulness, culminating in a work. And this work is articulated in the book of Jeremiah 31 verse 33. Jeremiah 31:33. Read this plenty of times, but I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. This is the work of the living God's righteousness. This is the living God's righteousness, is creation. It is creation for our inwards. That's why it says they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is God with us. It's not that God is with us, however we want to think about that. It is within us. And God in this context is defined as a wisdom or as a commandment. So what is to be within us is a commandment for the purpose of creation. This is the new covenant promise. This is what is attached to Abraham. In the book of Galatians chapter 3, if Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, and then in the next verse, so that the blessing of Abraham can come on us, can fall on us, it is Abraham's manner of devotion that currently matters more than Moses. Again, it is Abraham's manner of devotion that currently matters more than Moses, because it is Abraham that deals with faith. And in the same book of Galatians, we're told that the law is not of faith. The philosophy of the religious law involves no faith. It involves no faith because whether it is theory, right, belief, baptism, tradition, policy, so on and so forth, you're doing things with your body. And so the confidence is being through your body. You have to go through your body to know that your belief is real. So there is actually nothing profitable or nothing valuable about what is belonging or to do with your body physically. But when the body of faith is involved, then this promise of the new covenant can be fulfilled, of having the inwards of the conversation written. And it is written through a process of justification. Romans 5 verses 16 to 18. This ties in, I believe, perfectly. Romans 5, 16 to 18. Romans chapter 5 verses 16 to 18 reads, "And not as it was by one that sinned, so was the gift. For the judgment was by one to condemnation, but the free gift is of many offenses unto justification. For if by one man's offense death reigned by one, much more they which receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one, Jesus Christ. Therefore, as by the offense of one judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one the free gift came upon all men unto justification of life." So paying attention to a couple of things here in verse 16 is that this justification is by many offenses. So there's no such thing as Jesus did it all for me and all is well and I'm fine, according to the Bible. Nothing is all done for anyone. It is through many offenses that we enter into justification, meaning that justification is a process of growth and development where we are purging dead understanding in order to arrive at a more living and livable spirituality for our human being. So again, moving on from there is the gift of righteousness that is given to us. And this gift of righteousness is called grace. Grace is the substance of creation. If we dig into this, if we dig into what grace is according to the Bible, it is a substance of creation. It is the gift of righteousness. So if the righteousness of the living God is a faithfulness for creation inwardly, grace is given to aid in that creation inwardly. So if we can allow our conversation to experience the feeling or the appearance or the experience of passing through many offenses and of knowing our wrongs and then receiving correction via what is written within these words to apply them, we will receive grace for knowing and for knowledge concerning how to rise above for our human and for our devotional growth and development. We have to know that our faith needs to be continually fed. And the feeding of our faith is through a particular voice of understanding. This particular voice of understanding, it is a commandment of the living God's faithfulness. Now, this faithfulness cannot be achieved through specific deeds, rites, commandments associated to what is handwritten or associated to a philosophy of a religious law. The righteousness of the living God is by faith, meaning the faithfulness of the living God is by faith. The loving kindness of the living God is by faith. By faith in what? A promise of creation. So long as we maintain our faith, holding an understanding and continuing to grow in an understanding of what the living God's promise of creation is and to experience it, there will be no such rite, there will be no such deed, there will be no such theory that can substitute for that experience, because it will cleanse. It will cleanse our mind and it will cleanse our heart. Again, this is justification. This cleansing is of many offenses, meaning the way we hold our faith, the way we carry our body of understanding, it is wrong. It is all wrong. It is wrong because our understanding comes from a traditional scheme. It comes from within the religious world. And if we're going to believe how it says in the book of John 17, I am not of the world. If we're going to believe that individual, this world not meaning secular, meaning religious, then we too need to understand that our faith needs to not be of the religious world. Not being of the religious world, we need to personally take what we know, test it, experiment with it, bring it to the Bible, let the Bible expound on it, and help us to understand new principles to exercise. Because we're going to need to go through many offenses. We're going to need to register within our own heart and within our own mind the wrongs that we have committed against the faithfulness of the living God, in order to get to that point where our mind is clean and continually restored to pursue the loving kindness, the mercy, the truth, the commandment, the philosophy of the living God's promise for our conversation's inward parts. And so once we can do this, we have a promise of the gift of that righteousness, which is grace. If we could take the effort to do this, which is a very, very tough effort, we will receive grace. This grace will help us, help our faith, give us an understanding so that we can keep pursuing it repeatedly until it's perfected.